This is my version 2.1 follower. This is meant to be used with either a ball bearing or small key pin, spring, and grub screw. So when you print this, you may or may not use support for the hole, but it will probably need some cleaning up. On the side where the spiral interfaces with the outside of the follower, where it matches up here. Basically, you follow the flat end all the way to the end of the follower. On this side, there is a lip around these holes. It can be very difficult to see, but it's enough to retain the pin or bearing. So while cleaning out the holes, you want to insert the 3mm drill bit or number 6 drill bit on the side where the spiral does not connect with the outside of the follower. So you'd be inserting it here. Same on this side. So we would put it in, and have this in a pin vise. I would not recommend using an electric drill. And be very careful, because the bit will like to catch and then draw itself all the way through. You want to not get any further than that. The bearing will have a shallower radius, so a bearing may be trickier to get to both stay in and protrude enough to be effective. I find with the pointed end of a key pin, it works pretty well. So we insert that, push it in, see how much it sticks out. If you first push it down, it only goes that far. Just keep pushing a little bit until you get about that. And if the follower has appropriate clearances for the cylinder, that should be enough to detain the follower. Put the spring in. And then a 3.5 or number 6 grub screw. I want to have this just about even with the top. You don't want it sticking out because you don't want it to scrape the cylinder. But you have to be careful about how recessed it is. If you're working on the cylinder that's here, there's going to be a driver pin that lines up with this, because this will be going in that hole. And especially if you're working on this side, if you're using the spiral to get pin coming out of this chamber, this will line up with the adjacent chamber. So you do not want to use a grub screw that has a very large driver opening. You don't want the driver pin to get stuck in there. So I'll look at it from the side, and if it's just barely recessed, you may hear a click when the driver pin reaches this and steps off the edge. I find you can still get it back out this hole, as long as it doesn't go inside the hex hole for the driver. My version 2.1 has a small groove out the front here, so that if you do get a pin stuck, you can pull the follower this way. It'll expose the next chamber, but then you'll just be extracting pins the way you normally would. You may have to start over again, but you'll know you'll have to back out the grub screw. But I've used this several times with screws like this, and it works pretty well. Yesterday, I picked up this older ASSA Twin from a local locksmith. On the key, it just says Twin, and then we have the 51 for the 51 keyway and 079, which is the sidebar bitting. I'll put a link below for a page you can go to translate the number into the bitting. I believe this is an older 6000. The newer ones say 6000 on the key. If it was a Twin 2, it'd have a 2 there. And I believe the exclusive either say exclusive or have an E in front of the key code. Basically, most of the other submodels I've seen have some other indicator on the key as to what it is. So I believe, because there is nothing else on here, that this is a 6000. I have not opened this yet. It does have a Bible cover, so we could go into it that way, but I want to demonstrate this follower, so figured this would be a good time to show that, since I want to take it apart anyway to see what driver pins it has in it, whether they're the older gins, which I believe this should have, or if they're the newer barrels, or if it's just a locksmith special and some random shit. So this is a follower I designed, well, that I modeled. The spiral end is modeled after Crispix design, and the V side, I don't know where it originated from, but there are several out there, and also several that you can get with ball bearings that stick down and help retain the follower, either within the cylinder or by sticking down into the pin chamber holes and holding it in position for the next pin stack to go in. So I'll use the spiral follower to show extraction, and hopefully this has gins in it. We can see the gin heads, and that's another good way of showing pin orientation. And then I'll show at least one stack going back in with the spiral, and then using the V side to reassemble. With the Schlage style kicks, there are tools you can use that will insert in there that have the ridges that fit inside these crenellations and will depress that pin so we can unscrew this. But I don't have one of those, and I find it's just easy enough to press the pin down with a screwdriver. You just want to keep it away from the crenellations while you unscrew. Well, that LED bar on the arm that I had shown in an earlier video, it just died on me. I've only been using it for a month or two. Amazon has become Alibaba. There is a very big drawback to buying cheap shit. I really do like having that positionable LED broad light, so I think I'll spend a little bit more and get an actually good light. Yeah, I'm going to change my recommendation and don't buy the cheap $14 version. One of those days where my left arm really is not behaving. All right. I forgot to move my chair up. That's better. I want to use a shim, put it in along the Bible. This lock is pretty gummed up, so the cylinder isn't sliding around on its own, but you do want to keep control of the cylinder within the housing while you're doing this, because it can very easily just slip out since the key is in there and the core is rotated. There are no pins holding it in, and the sidebar is retracted. If you're in doubt as to whether the shim is in all the way, you can just take another one next to it. So not quite all the way to the end, but looks like it's covering the Bible. So when extracting the cylinder and using this type of follower, you want to cover as much of the rear of the plug as possible, aligned with the Bible. Pins will be in the Bible here, so we don't want to use this end. Don't forget to pull this pin out. When you're using the V end, you want to align it like that so that you don't have to bridge the gap with the shim. Probably can, but you run the risk of slipping. In this orientation, the shim has to do much less work. Now we slowly slide it out. Keep the top of the plug facing up if it means rotating the Bible. That way when you pull the plug out, the key pins don't go spilling everywhere. So that's where the sidebar is. So we'll have to be mindful of that. I'll put my finger there. And the front face of the plug goes pretty deep. So that's why the shim didn't go in as far as I expected. I ended up rotating the follower without realizing it, but luckily the shim seems to have prevented any driver pins from falling out of the Bible. And that's why I always use a shim, even if I think a lock doesn't strictly need it. So sidebars are often not symmetrical. On the top, you see it's pretty much a straight line from the tip of the triangle here to this edge of the triangle, whereas on this side there's a slight step. On some locks that will matter. I do not know if it does on this one, but I'm going to remember that and put the sidebar back in that orientation. In some locks I've seen them the other way around. As I remember, the bi-lock, the sidebars are the other way around. Oh, that's right. The sidebars determine the bitting rather than the pins. So that orientation is important if you want to keep the same sidebar bitting and have the key work when you reassemble it. Because if you put this on the upside down, you'll get different bitting. We've got the sidebar springs. I already showed the sidebar, so it's okay if that leaves view. This is ending up a terrible example for a gutting video because I'm not paying particularly good attention to where I'm putting things down or whether I'm blocking things. We're going to do the key pins first because I don't want to block the plug we're reaching for and working on the small rig. So this pin right here in the front, it's not an actual lock pin, it's an anti-drill pin. It may fall out, but that's simply a steel pin to mess up any drill bits if someone tries to drill in from the front. I'm just going to show the side pins while they're in there. So as we remove this key, the side pins will no longer be retained. You know what? I should have removed this extra key. I should have done that to start with. Having that flop around was not a smart idea. Having just a single key to keep track of, much better. So we have the side pin here with that true gate in the center, and then the serrations above and below it, and the spring resting in the cup on the top. Maybe I should have cleaned this a little bit at least before gutting it. Might have made this slightly easier. If this was an actual gutting video, I'd show each of these a little bit closer as I pulled them out, but I won't make you sit through that. They're all identical. For this lock, the side pins are identical and the bitting is determined by the sidebar. For other types of locks, the sidebar has either the same height pins all the way across or the same height notches, and the pins themselves will all be different. Now I'll do the key pins. With the plug out, you can try dumping it out, covering all but one, but if you want to show orientation, in case there's any torpedoes, you can simply push up from the bottom and you'll be able to see the pin without it just dumping out. In this case, it's just a standard. good to get lined up correctly. But so that was actually pin 5. Here's pin 6. That's another standard. So these may all be standards. There's pin 3, pin 2, and pin 1. In this case, they were all standards. I had to file out the inner diameter of this plug holder. It's just slightly too small still. So now we want to show the milling on the core. There was so much gunk in there. First I thought there wasn't any. So this is a case where you definitely want to use a pick or similar to click it, because there's so much gunk in there, you can barely tell that there's anything there. Be mindful of the Bible, because we haven't shown the driver pins yet. So we don't want that to leave or to block it. So there actually is milling in there. Even though it was difficult to see. So in this case, it's 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6, and none in 3. So much gunk. Not even clicking. There we go. Nothing in 3. The reason I kept doing that is because I was only getting the first click where the pick dropped off the shelf, but then I wasn't getting anything here. But that lip is important, so you want that second click. And now that I've disturbed the gunk, you can see it a little bit better. That's why it's good to do both, to show and to click. Now we want to extract the driver pins from the Bible. It's important to remember which side is the front and which is the rear. In this case, the flush Bible is the rear. If in doubt and you lost track with an asymmetrical follower, you can just remember which way you pushed the follower in. I know that we used this end to butt up against the rear of the plug. So therefore the front is here and the front had to be here, which matches up with the slightly pushed back side of the Bible. I'm going to use the small rig as a helping hand. I'm going to move the camera, so I want to keep the lock and the small rig close together so that while I'm moving it, if I have any shakes or anything like that, the lock won't go out of frame. Put it so we can see both. I'm going to be using the spiral side, so we're going to be extracting from the rear. And we've already shown the milling pins, etc. So I'm not too concerned about blocking that. So the G-dent pin will be slightly outside the lock. We're going to want to move that inside. Take a little extra push. And we want the straight part here pointed almost down, because the pins will be coming up here. So we want the left edge of this straight part of the spiral lined up with the left edge of the Bible, basically where they meet here. Push back. So now we're going to slide it, the follower back until The pin is under the spiral section. And then we rotate. So it should move up as we turn it now, like so. And we can see we have a gin head. So, hooray, we've shown orientation on the gin without the pin just going flying everywhere. And hooray for me, because it confirms I have an ASSA Twin 6000 with gins. So this is going to go in the tray for stack 6. Springs can be tricky. So again, we move the spiral down. And I've already seen the curved top of the gin head, so the next one is also a gin. So here I'll demonstrate if we have it rotated about that far, and then we pull back. Hear that click? It was small, but that tells me that I've now pulled it back far enough that I can rotate, and it will come out. With this follower, what happened just there was the gin in chamber 3, the head of it was stuck up against the set screw of the follower. That's why I don't tighten down the set screws too far, because it'll leave a hole where the gin heads can fall in. I do have a gap here, so if you do get stuck, you can pull it back. It's more of an emergency escape because you're just going to have to go from pin to pin and then pull the gin heads out as normal if that happens. But if you get the set screw at the right height, you can use it as I'm using it here. So now I'm going to demonstrate how to use the spiral to put the pins back in. Insert this in a spring. Get the gin started. I like to grip it as far back as possible, like so. And then get as far down in with the tweezers. Bring the follower up so it butts up against the tweezers. Rotate under. At this point, we can pull the tweezers out before they get trapped in there, and then rotate. You may have to just nudge it slightly. And then when you get to about here, now you can come forward. And now do the next one. Put the spring in and repeat. Now we're going to do chamber 3. Here's the click. I find it odd that chamber 3 has no milling, but they still put a gin in it. And in the requirements for Black Belt 2, it does require 6 gins. I'm not going to try to get that spring out. I'm just going to do the next one. We get the 2 springs out at the same time. That's the gin head on the spiral. And the follower is pretty much most of the way out of the housing. So it'd be real easy to just fumble this and let go. Keeping a finger on top will help keep it in position. And we can see the gin head. Pull the follower the rest of the way out. You see the two springs in there. So there it is. I've cleaned up the lock using Houdini, paper towel, and an old toothbrush for the internals. And then I used some abrasive pads for the externals. The keys are steel, so you can be a little more aggressive with those, but you want to be careful with the brass. Turns out the sidebar has that kind of flat lip on both the top and bottom. It was just, I couldn't see it because it was dirty. And while cleaning it, I ended up losing track of the orientation, but with this key, it's easy enough. We want 1 and 2 high, 3 and 4 low, and 5 medium. So that would be this. 1 and 2 high, 3 and 4 low, and 5 medium. So if we face it, turn around, face it that way. All right, I'm gonna put the finger pins back in. I think sideways. So hopefully I won't lose the spring. The springs aren't actually attached, they're just sitting inside the side pins. They have little cups. You want all the side pins to move freely and bounce back. And with the key in, it'll retain them. Put the key pins back in. So now we want to put the cylinder back in the housing. So we want the V to be against the back. The cylinder goes in the housing this way, so we want to insert it this way. We want Bible down. We want the tension pin down. I realized this is quite loose. I measured and the plug is actually just shy of 13 millimeters. So when I designed these, I was going by sizes that are existed, and most of what I saw was 12.6 or 14. I'm just going to upload some 13 millimeter and print out some for myself because apparently those are needed as well. So we're going to work this from the back. So I'm going to pull this back down. And we just want to align the bottom of the V with the back chamber. Put the pin for chamber 6 in. And if this was a flat follower trying to put this pin in, you'd have to put it in and try to get it to overcome the spring down into the chamber, hold it down with your tweezers, and then push the follower over it. Because it's a V, we can put the pin on top of the spring and it will be cradled inside the V, resting on the spring. And now we push down. And you get it down far enough so that the pin is completely in the chamber, you slide the follower forward, and then you should bring it forward until the pin or bearing that's in the follower rests in the hole of the chamber you just filled, which should position the V for the next chamber. And now you can let go of the follower if you need to, because the pin or bearing that's in the follower is holding it in place. So if you need to use two hands to set up the spring within your tweezers or what have you, you can do so. So now we do the next driver pin for chamber 5. It's nestled in the V. The detaining pin is now in chamber 5. And we can put the spring in for chamber 4. Now that we're a bit closer, it'll be a little easier to see what's actually going on. So right about there, the detaining pin is now in chamber 3. Everything's a little loose because the follower is a little bit undersized. It's still being held in there pretty well. So spring for chamber 2. And push down, bring the follower forward. Detent pin goes, overshoots. Goes into the chamber you just filled. Now we want the plug back in the lock. I'm not going to be putting this back on. I hate tails, and even though it'll be removing this spacer here, this does not have an impact on how tight the core is retained, because the core itself is threaded, and this retaining ring, you would just simply tighten it down enough to take up that gap. So we got the small springs for the sidebar. There we go. Knock this around. Let's see. Yeah, and I remembered the mid is out at the tip. So if we turn it like this, the mid is here. And to test it, you just simply press it in. And it recesses enough that the tip does not stick out past the core. I often find it's easier to position the shim first and then slide the housing over it than try to force the shim under it. The pins seem to pop up over the shim easier that way than trying to slide the shim under the pins. I think the easiest thing to do without spilling them is to line up the Bible between the sidebar and the key pins like this. All right, the sidebar's retained now. Put my thumb there to keep the shim from popping up on top of that and binding up. All right, don't need the follower anymore. Push the cylinder the rest of the way in. Remove the shim. And it should the sidebar pop into place. Yes, key works. I'm going to remove it because we don't need it in there anymore. and it reduces the chance of accidentally popping the core back out while we fiddle with it. So now, put the spring pin back in. So I like to turn this as far as it'll go just to get it started. Push the pin in, hold it down, and then tighten the ring as far as it'll go. So that's as far as it'll go without cranking on it. Then I usually back it out to the next one. Test it. If it feels tight, then you can back it out one more. Yeah, that feels a little smoother. So I'm going to stick with it there. So that's how you get a lock that requires a follower while still showing pin orientation using this style of follower with the spiral. So thanks for watching. I hope you found some of this useful, and I will catch you later.